Hi and welcome to episode 2 of Asia Shorts. This week I'm going to talk about North Korea again, but I'm going to focus on the international relations of Northeast Asia and how North Korea fits into the security considerations of the various countries in the region. Let me start by letting you into a dirty little secret. For most of the countries in the region, for all the problems that we have with Pyongyang, and for all of the uncertainty about its leader and the allegations of his conduct, a continuation of the status quo is much more preferable than any dramatic change to it. And let's explain why. Let's start by talking about China. China is probably, after the United States, the most important actor in dealing with North Korea. It is, after all, an ally of North Korea. In fact, it is North Korea's only major significant political and economic ally. And this is a result of history. Both countries are communist, even though China has largely abandoned communism as a political ideology. They nevertheless have been allies for over 50 years. If it hadn't been for the intervention of Chinese troops into the Korean War in 1950, it is likely that the North Korean regime would have lost and that the United States would have been successful in unifying Korea under a pro-Western leadership. And so the ties run deep. So why would China prefer an unpredictable leader in Pyongyang, a leader that provokes the United States, that provokes the West, that continues to pursue its missile program and its nuclear program, even when Beijing expresses disappointment or worse, and even when, as it did in 2013, it supported a UN resolution against Pyongyang? Because it would much rather have an ally between it and a pro-Western regime than to have a united Korea that was pro-Western and at worst might have American troops on its soil. It's better to have a buffer between it. And so that really explains it. It is also useful from a security perspective for the Chinese to tie up the United States with the North Korean security problem than to have it completely focused on China and China's growing role in the region politically, economically, and strategically. Okay, so that's it put in a very simple way. Let's turn now to South Korea. Now surely you'd think South Korea would prefer to have a unified peninsula. Well, it may be the long-term goal of successive administrations to encourage greater ties, to encourage family reunions, to grow economic cooperation towards some distant dream of reunification. But the last thing that South Korea would want to do would be to foot the bill for an extremely expensive reunification in the short term. One only has to look at the enormous cost to Western Germany of the reunification of East Germany. Some put the cost of that reunification at over $1 trillion, maybe even more dollars that it's cost Western Europe, that it's cost Western Germany. And so Korea doesn't want to face that. The difference as well between the economies of North Korea and South Korea is much greater than the gap was between Eastern Germany and Western Germany. North Korea's economy is just short of $2 trillion in size, whereas the North is estimated to be a little more than 40 billion. And no, I've not mispronounced that. 40 billion versus nearly $2 trillion. The average South Korean enjoys a standard of living at around 38,000 US dollars. The average North Korean, a little under $2,000. So incorporating 25 million people who are at a much lower level of income, and the transformation that would be required would be a cost that would be an enormous drain on North Korea. So again, North Korea, at least for the conceivable future, certainly would prefer not to have the provocations from the North, certainly would prefer to have improved diplomatic relations, but it doesn't want to see any dramatic change in the status quo overnight. Let's, for example, assume a catastrophic situation where the North would collapse as a result of some leadership crisis. What would that entail? Well, we can imagine that tens of thousands of, maybe hundreds of thousands of refugees would try to make their way north to China or try to make their way south across the DMZ to South Korea. Neither country wants to have a humanitarian crisis on its hands of a scale that Asia hasn't seen for many, many decades. Okay, now let's look at Japan very quickly. Japan historically has viewed Korea as an area that it has had an influence over. It occupied Korea for a good 70 plus years. This has drawn a lot of ire from Koreans even to this day. Japan would rather have a pro-Western sympathetic regime in the South than a much more strong nationalistic regime in a unified Korea. A unified Korea of 75 million would be a much greater economic challenge to Japan in the region, a much greater political challenge to Japan's influence in the region, and arguably, potentially, a much greater military challenge to Japan. So, once more, the status quo is preferable. And that then leaves us with Russia as the only country that I've not mentioned beside the United States. And Russia's influence is much less than China, but again, it's pretty much the same story. Russia shares a very small land border with North Korea. It was the Soviet Union's green light that encouraged North Korea to invade the South in 1950. When the Soviet Union was around, North Korea and the Soviet Union had very strong relations. Those have largely continued in post-Soviet Russia. But the influence that Moscow has in the region is much less than it used to be. Nevertheless, just like China, the Russians would not want to see a unified pro-Western state on its border in Asia. And so, there is the overall international relations of the region in a nutshell. Don't have time to talk about the United States and South Korea, North Korea situation. Maybe we'll save that for another day. And so, it's goodbye from me, and next week, well, let's leave next week as a mystery. I'll surprise you with what our episode 3 will be about.